Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Monday, December 8th, day 794 of the war. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our editor, David Horovitz, joining us from our Jerusalem office. Hi, David. Thanks for joining me today.
Sure. Hi, Amanda.
Syria is marking a year to the overthrow of the Bashar al-Assad regime. We'll hear how its current leader, a former terrorist, is now being feted on world stages. The pressure to move to phase 2 of the Trump peace plan is increasing, and we'll learn how our Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is responding, expressing his willingness but also his concerns. And even as Israel was roundly criticized at the Doha Forum over the weekend, the U.S. is attempting to mend bridges between Israel and Qatar and Israel and Egypt. We'll hear more. We'll learn all about this and more when we're back.
Over 2,000 years ago, the Hanukkah flame burned against all odds, a symbol of resilience and hope that still shines brightly today. Now, Israel once again turns to light, not just to remember, but to protect and rebuild. As the country rises from 2 years of war, the Technion's brightest minds are leading the way, revitalizing the economy, strengthening national security, and shaping a future full of promise. This Hanukkah, we honor the Technion minds who bring light to the darkness, in our labs, on our front lines, and in our hearts. May the light of innovation illuminate every corner of Israel, heralding a new era of strength and renewal.
I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our editor, David Horovitz. Former Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad fled to Russia a year ago as rebels commanded by Syria's new president, Ahmed al-Sharaa, seized Damascus. So al-Sharaa was initially greeted with skepticism for his terrorist ties, but he's now being paraded on world stages such as the Doha Forum over the weekend. Israel, on the other hand, not so much. So, David, you were pretty recently in Damascus, and I wonder how you heard al-Sharaa being spoken by some Syrians as opposed to, or in addition to, how he is being referred to currently in international media.
So yes, indeed, I was in Damascus, as I think I've talked about at inordinate length in the past, but thank you for reminding our listeners. And I can't claim that I spoke to ordinary Syrians at any length about al-Sharaa. Those that I and others in this little group did speak to were, it was in Damascus, which was a bit of a bubble, I suspect, in terms of the civil war. They were certainly broadly supportive of the new leadership, even though economically the currency had devalued quite significantly, for example. The people associated with that leadership, including ministers and officials that we spoke to, were strikingly candid, I would say, about this being kind of make or break for Syria and very focused on trying to stabilize Syria. Where we went, thinking of the foreign ministry and the economics or the trade ministry, there were other international, governmental delegations as opposed to ours. As we left the trade minister, for example, there was a Czech government group that was coming in to meet with him. The clear sense that we got was that the international community was becoming increasingly supportive of this improbably legitimized, if you like, new leadership, because they were coming to believe that al-Sharaa and his team were serious about trying to stabilize Syria. And in the foreign ministry, strikingly, the person who heads the Department for American Affairs, which is a really big deal in the foreign ministry of Syria, as you can imagine, was extremely warmly disposed towards what was, broadly speaking, most of which was a group of American Jewish leaders or figures. I'm not even sure that they would consider themselves leaders particularly, but, prominent people who'd made the effort to come to Syria, not remotely bothered that here was an Israeli journalist with the group, but very unhappy with Israel. And I'm certain that that's what they had been saying. And I had no doubt that al-Sharaa, who, as you rightly say, Trump gushed over when they met, the claim that we heard was that Israel was targeting the regime instead of targeting bad people in various raids and strikes and that Israel was interested in instability in southern Syria because then it would give it more control, but that was not in Israel's interests. This Syria's senior figure claimed when he spoke to us that if the new leadership had not managed to stabilize southern Syria pretty quickly after ousting Assad, he said Iran and Hezbollah would have taken over, and that's not a good interest. And as you rightly say, al-Sharaa has been more outspoken since, notably in Doha, when he was also very critical of Israel in its behavior in Gaza. And I can only say that from my very brief interaction with figures in this leadership, they're very, very articulate, very impressive, and this is what they're telling the world. They're telling the world, we're trying to stabilize Syria. Among the difficulties we're having is that Israel is making trouble for us. Israel would argue that the new leadership is part of the problem, that it's been targeting the Druze in southern Syria especially, and at the very least also allowing other bad people to target the Druze. And Israel needs to be more wary than the Trump administration because it happens to be next door. Those are not empty arguments at all. But if you're trying to understand how this is going over in the region, but beyond the region, it would seem to me, with my relative inexpertise, I would stress that this leadership is making a very effective play to the international community, and partially at the expense of Israel, but broadly to say, hey, come help us save this country. I would imagine that is a message that they are articulating really well, and that well-intentioned international leaders are pretty receptive to it.
Now, one of the sticking points, of course, in the vacuum left from the fall of the Assad regime, Israel filled into what we call the buffer zone, but part of that is the Hermon mountain. And that's an extremely strategic point for Israel in terms of our national security. Now, if you take the first Trump administration, which did recognize the Golan Heights, and you take this Trump administration, which is very pro-Israel. Obviously, we've spoken about that at length, and at the same time, very pro-al-Sharaa. You have to wonder, is it a flip of the coin kind of decision? Who will be able to protect its own national interests in terms of this buffer zone, which is a hugely problematic area in finalizing some kind of, I don't know, détente, at least, between Syria and Israel?
So, that's even the way you're framing it is nicely optimistic. In other words, you've got an administration that is trying to reconcile conflicting security needs, conflicting claims, conflicting assessments, but with goodwill. And I'm sure this is what the U.S. administration is saying, not just thinking, but saying, okay, so you find your physical compromise on the ground. You understand the mutual concerns, and as was the case, I mean, with Assad, there was a formal declaration of war between these two countries. These countries were not at peace or at normalization. You've got the United States now, including with some direct contacts, trying to foster some kind of security arrangement. You've had al-Sharaa saying he's interested in it. I think Israel would be interested in a credible and protective security arrangement, and that seems to be what the administration is doing. It's not, for example, a case of the administration walking back any recognition of Israeli sovereignty in areas that Israel was holding and had extended sovereignty to under the previous sequence of Assad leaderships. So I don't think it requires that. It requires fostering some confidence and some understanding between these two leaderships. That's what I think the Americans are trying to do.
Okay, we are going to go to a short break and then discuss the move or potential move to phase 2 of the Trump peace plan in Gaza.
3 million Israelis are dealing with trauma since October 7th. To help Israelis heal, Hadassah is there, with the largest rehabilitation center in Jerusalem, world-renowned medical centers, and youth villages. It's said, saving a life saves the world. Imagine helping millions. This is Hadassah, a life-changing force in Israel and the world.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our editor, David Horovitz. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Mike Waltz arrived in Israel this morning on an official visit focused on pushing Washington's peace plan in Gaza. Yesterday, we heard our Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu make several statements about the peace plan, his willingness to move to phase 2, but also his concerns along the way. So, David, let's start with what was said at the meetup with Chancellor Merz from Germany yesterday in the early afternoon, and then move to what was said later on in the night.
Well, Netanyahu, as you say, hosting the German Chancellor, has and since as well has expressed support for moving to phase 2. Remember, he accepted the entire Trump 20-point plan, which is a broad plan for peace and long-term stability for Gaza. He stressed that the one remaining deceased hostage, Ram Gvili, must be returned. And of course, he's adamant that the key element of phase 2 from Israel's point of view, which is that Hamas be disarmed and the Gaza Strip be demilitarized, be implemented. Later in the day, he also expressed skepticism about how this is intended to play out. I mean, remember, we're in a situation now where Israel has withdrawn from a little less than half of Gaza. There is no alternative force to Hamas in the 47% where Israel is no longer present and Hamas has reemerged. Hamas is giving no indication or no credible indication. There was a comment yesterday from an official about a potential willingness to store its weaponry. I don't think that's remotely acceptable to Israel. Israel wants to see Hamas disarmed and the Strip demilitarized. And Netanyahu made clear later in the evening that he doesn't think any force, even sort of an American-led force, is going to be able to do that. You know, if they can, that would be great, is the kind of thing he was saying. But he imagines it will fall to Israel. So you've got Hamas, demanding a full Israeli withdrawal. You've got Qatar, for example, saying the same thing. And you've got an Israel that's saying, well, the key element for us is stability and security, and that requires a disarmed Hamas and demilitarized Strip. That's what phase 2 provides for. Of course we want that. We just don't believe that anyone other than us, or as Netanyahu puts it, we're very skeptical that anyone other than Israel will be able to do this.
Right. In fact, the terminology that's being used with this stabilization force is the word patrolling. That's what I'm hearing more and more. And of course, patrolling is very different from even peacekeeping or even, causing the demilitarization of Hamas. And another thing that struck me yesterday in terms of headlines is the IDF Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir was on a tour of the Strip, and he said something along the lines when he got to the yellow line, as we call it, which is the end of the 53% that Israel is holding. He said, this is the new border. So I'm not 100% sure what he meant by that, but it is, in a way, what is happening on the ground right now, that this is the new border. We have Israel-controlled Gaza, and then we have Hamas Stan on the other side of the yellow line. And I do wonder if the stabilization force would just be marking that border. It's very hard to determine.
Well, we've had a lot of experience with varieties of peacekeeping forces that are not, in fact, capable of actually doing anything when bad people flex their military muscle. So I suppose Zamir was describing the reality, which is this is the border for the time being, at least. You've got, in a way, you kind of come back to the difficulty that has existed from the start, which is what kind of credible force is going to take over from Hamas. You've got a Netanyahu insistence that it not be the Palestinian Authority. We've discussed this many times, that it not be linked to the Palestinian Authority, whereas the regional players that have expressed some willingness to get involved are conditioning their involvement on something that is credibly Palestinian. They don't want to be the ones usurping Palestinian control. That's not their idea at all. They would be happy to bolster, in some cases, Palestinian control. So there's no alternative that the outside players in this region can live with, that Israel is prepared to live with. And in the meantime, you've got this vacuum where Hamas has reemerged. And you've got all kinds of conflicting pressures in the Doha forum in Qatar over the last 3 days. You've had a succession of leaders saying things about Gaza, notably including the Qataris saying, A, they're not going to finance what Israel has destroyed, quote unquote, but also coming back to, we've got to move ahead here now. We need to change the reality. And this great big hole in the middle. Okay, so who's going to disarm Hamas, which, like I say, has been Israel's challenge since October the 7th, and very much more relevantly so since the ceasefire went into effect, because as Israel, as it was required to do on phase one, pulled back, nobody reliably stable, reliably stable took over. All that happened was that Hamas was able to reemerge.
Right. And even as Doha is saying things along what you just mentioned, that it's not going to write the checks for the destruction that Israel wrought in Gaza, we're hearing reports that Steve Witkoff, U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, met with Israeli and Qatari officials in a push to mend some kind of ties. What do you know about these reports? Are they verified at this point?
I don't know that they're verified. I think they're pretty credible. It may even be that there was a phone call that you will recall that President Trump brokered at the Oval Office between Netanyahu and the Qatari Prime Minister, in which Netanyahu apologized for the failed strike on the Hamas leadership that Israel carried out in Doha, apologized for breaching Qatar's sovereignty, essentially. And I think the Qatari official who was in the room in the Oval Office may well have been the person with whom David Barnea, the outgoing head of the Mossad, was meeting yesterday, as far as we know. I'd be surprised if that wasn't the case, but there may be more to it. So you've got these two conflicting processes. You've got a White House trying to foster some kind of warming of very, very badly harmed ties, even as the most prominent Qatari leaders, notably including the Prime Minister, are trashing Israel and condemning Israel in front of the international communities. Not only a regional gathering that was held in Doha. There's lots of people from all over the world there. And I know we've discussed this before, and you've discussed this before with Jacob Magid, who's just coming back from Doha. He was there, our reporter for the Times of Israel. It's not just the Qataris, it's also the Saudis and the Turks and the Syrians, as we've said. A long line of fairly prominent people from many countries in this region use that forum to denounce Israel, broadly speaking, over the war in Gaza.
So let's turn to Egypt. Along the same lines, the U.S. is trying to broker some kind of summit between Netanyahu and al-Sisi. And last week we had a situation, just for example, in which the IDF decided to reopen the Rafah crossing for pedestrians crossing into Egypt. But Egypt, it appears to me, has barred that because they want everything to be two-way crossing. So obviously sharing borders and sharing this border with Gaza, Israel and Egypt have huge interest in working together. But again, we're seeing that the two countries are at loggerheads with the U.S. trying to push some kind of bridging experience, event, summit, call it what you will.
Yep, that's exactly right. And I think the US has also indicated that if it can get this moving between Israel and Egypt, if it can get those ties warming, if Israel can take some steps that would be perceived as helpful, for example, finalizing if Egypt and Israel can finalize a gas deal, which Netanyahu is apparently willing to do, but wants to sort of publicly celebrate it at the meeting with Sisi. I think the administration is asking Israel for other gestures or other steps that can be helpful for Egypt. The American position is then that can be sort of a case study or a model for improving ties with others in the region, notably including the Saudis, who, as I stress in Doha, I mean, there were at least two Saudi officials who spoke at that conference and were very, very critical of Israel. And if you think of, the proximity of potential normalization, Jacob had this very long piece about how close things were before October the 7th, had all sorts of very interesting detail, which I know you've discussed. You compare that to what the Saudi officials said in Doha about, one very prominent Saudi official said Israel is not a partner for peace the way things are at the moment, or this Israeli government isn't, never mind the peace, they're not even partners for a ceasefire. So you've got the Americans trying to push back and they would say, I'm sure, trying to help Israel help itself. You've got a prime minister who wants to build warm relations, certainly with Egypt and certainly with the Saudis. and the way they see it is not prepared to take the steps. I'm talking about those regional countries. He's not prepared to take the steps that would enable this. So it's a very important mediation role that the administration can play here. And we know that, of course, the Prime Minister is going to the White House for the 5th time this year in the next few days. I don't think the dates have been finalized yet, certainly not publicly. I mean, they're going to be talking about all of this. You've got an American president that is trying to foster peace, and each of the people and the sides with whom he is trying to broker agreements are telling him it's the other side's fault. They're not prepared to do what we need to do in order to advance these processes.
I mean, for me, I'm a bit of a skeptic, as you know, and I always wonder what part of this is performative, meaning what part of all these very harsh statements is the Arab leaders talking to their population, and what part of it is actually from the heart. So, when you're talking economics and some kind of deal, such as the gas deal, that speaks to a different logic set than when you're condemning Israel for being, well, the Jewish state, essentially. So I do wonder always what is truth and what is, smoke and mirrors in these situations.
Right, I think you're right to do so. But bring into that mix, I would say, the fact that the street, as we often speak about in the Arab world, including in very dictatorial regimes, is much more hostile to Israel than it was 2 years ago. And by the way, to push back against that and know that Netanyahu, for example, he may have discussed it, Barnea may have discussed this in his meeting yesterday with a Qatari official. Netanyahu and Israel, broadly speaking, are pretty angry that Qatar is inciting against Israel via Al Jazeera. So, the street's more hostile to Israel, part of that at least. I mean, there are facts on the ground and narratives on the ground, but certainly the narrative that is acutely hostile to Israel is being peddled by a Qatari-funded, incredibly widely watched television network. So if, for example, the Saudis or even existing partners are troubled by the mood in the Arab street with growing hostility to Israel, it does limit their room for maneuver, and at least part of it is being carried out by them. If you follow, I mean, Qatar and the Saudis, it's a pretty uneasy relationship, to put it mildly, but it's a very complicated situation with like I say, grievance and contradictory narratives and pressures on both sides, as well as the performative element of it.
So let's talk about what we discussed last week, David. If you remember, you and I spoke about the idea of a pardon for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for the entire episode. So those who missed it, please check it out. And yesterday, our Prime Minister was asked during the meeting with Chancellor Merz if he would retire from politics, for example, or commit to any kind of a plea bargain in order to see this pardon through. So back up slightly, David, and tell us what we know about who asked for the pardon, which we know is the Prime Minister, but any kind of stipulations that we think very concisely, and then talk about what exactly our Prime Minister said yesterday.
Yeah, we can do it very briefly. I mean, Netanyahu formally submitted a request for a pardon. Atypically, he's in mid-trial. He did not acknowledge guilt. He did not acknowledge remorse. And even in those submissions and accompanying comments, he insisted that the charges against him are unfounded and fabricated, and the process by which he was investigated and indicted was illegitimate. So this is not a contrite request, as is the norm, because you're asking for a pardon. And it's created quite a complex dilemma for President Isaac Herzog, who it would appear would have the right to issue a pardon, because by virtue, you could argue that simply in asking for a pardon, given that the president has the right to pardon offenders, Netanyahu is enabling the president to consider him to be an offender, even though he's not actually said that. But Netanyahu has made clear, and he made it explicit yesterday in this very curious joint appearance with the German Chancellor, curious in that the questions were very limited. And the questions about this were at the very end, when they kind of thought that the two leaders, at least, were sort of bringing their appearance to an end. And an Israeli reporter asked the Prime Minister, I think I'm right to say in Hebrew, are you prepared to retire from public life if you are granted a pardon? And he replied with the single word, no. And then a second reporter followed up with, are you open to a plea bargain? And he, again, single word, said no. And then he said, I will add, they're very eager. They're very, he was implying that the media in Israel wants to see him gone, although he didn't explicitly say that. But he did say the voters will decide. So this was the most definitive single word in both cases, case of the prime minister saying, I am not going to quit public life as a condition for a pardon if the president, for example, would try to impose that on me. And this has been, well, actually, I'm not sure it's been totally clear, and certainly not as definitive for some time. I'm also not open to the notion of a plea bargain.
Okay. David, thank you so much for all of your updates and insights today.
Thanks, Amanda. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about today's episode or any other episode from any other series, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow. Shalom.